Hey everybody, I'm here at my favorite living place, well, my favorite local living place. I haven't seen most of the living places, and this one, though it's genuinely alive, it's artificial in the sense that humans put it together, which is kind of weird when you think about it. We have this term curated, but for living, you don't want to curate living beings or places much at all. Although humans that relate with living places, have roles where the living places transform the humans, and the humans transform the living places. And without being deeply connected to a living place, we're kind of missing. Okay, so this crow, I think it has it has maybe a strawberry. Sharing. They're sharing.
Oliver's coming for backup. He'll wait outside the bathroom door. It's just a...
Hopefully I got the camera angle right on that. I can't really tell when I'm pointing the camera away from me what it's pointing at. In any case, living places act as extensions of human beings, and human beings act as extensions of living places, except they're not really extensions, they're organs. So when we're lacking intimacy with living places, it is as if we've been deprived of fundamental aspects of our humanity. And one could conceivably argue that the kind and intelligent relationships with living places that humans are capable of endow those places with hands, right? And eyes. So when I speak to the trees or the flowers or the sage plant, I sneeze. Here, look at a tree while I sneeze. I offer my humanity to them, to share in my interiority. Not usually with my physical voice, though sometimes I do. Because most of the living places and the beings in them, the plants and animals and stuff, they don't care about face noises. They care about what's in your heart. They can sense what is in your heart, in my perspective. And obviously when I'm making these videos, I'm not trying to tell anyone how things are, what I think is. I'm suggesting perspectives that I hope may be useful. Even if my language may veer more toward, identification. So, today I'm kind of upset and sort of inspired, so you might see me a little bit angry. And in fact, if I were to tell the truth, most days lately I've been kind of upset. This is one of my favorite organisms here. It's a Canary Island strawberry tree, according to biologists. But according to the tree, it's just itself. It might recognize others of its kind. They don't have a name for themselves. At least, I don't think so. Ah, here is the branch that fell yesterday. Ah, yeah. Great. So if you happen to be watching my video yesterday, oh yeah, there it is, huh? Wow, cool. I was wondering, I came over here, but I didn't see it. But here's the branch that fell. That definitely would have killed anybody beneath it. And a long time ago in forestry, they had this term widowmaker, which was the name of branches that fall like that. And that's a cypress tree. I'm going to actually walk around this thing, and because I want to see the other part. So I'm going to actually walk beneath the place where it broke, and we can look at this. Yeah, it doesn't take much. The scent of this wood is very redolent. It doesn't take much to kill a human being. It doesn't take much of a thing falling from the sky to kill a human being. 5-10 pounds if it hits you in the right way, and it's over. So I'm feeling kind of upset today, though. As I was saying, I usually have a veneer, a layer where I'm unhappy or upset, regardless of how friendly or enthusiastic I may appear in my videos. Like many other people, I've experienced profound suffering. And although when we are healthy and our lives are going modestly well in this bizarre culture we live in, things seem relatively normal most of the time. Unless there's some significant event, an accident, we call them, or a crisis, or, violence or crime. Most of the time, things seem pretty orderly. And we take this to mean, I think, at least in a general way, that, oh, this is interesting, there's a hummingbird harassing a sparrow. So there's a drama going on up here. There's a couple of little insect-eating birds. Swimming right there, hopefully you can see it. But there was some hummingbirds harassing a sparrow on the branch. Anyway, we because things are relatively ordinary for many of us, in the sense of there not being terrifying, unexpected crises, or the sudden intrusion of violence into our lives, though I'm going to penetrate that illusion pretty quick. Oh, here's something amazing. That is going to turn into this kind of octopoid seed-like stuff. Right? This is the fertility of these palms. Here's a better look. And here's a fruiting one. And as you can see, there are different different orders of living time being represented there. Huh. Some of us live in a kind of fantasy world. And it's nice for us because most of the time we're not being directly, overtly oppressed like slaves might have been. And we're not being directly, overtly perpetrated upon. And part of the reason for that is that the primary, the central aspects of harm, wrongdoing, and violation are highly distributed. They're distributed so that they take little pieces of us. They take little pieces of all of us and build a mountain out of that. And if there's 500 different sort of, this is really cool. Never seen anything like this before on this plant. So Puya baterioniana. It's a pineapple-like relative. In any case, you have like thousands or hundreds of thousands of corporations, right? Some significant number of those use prison labor to produce products, and they all make a profit, and they all distribute damage into the history. This is really important. The history and future, the history, present, and future of life on Earth. So they all hide that damage really well in the environment and in the poor and in the disempowered, the sick, the elderly, children, the underprivileged, as we call them. And so our culture is really vampiric at its basis. It's fundamentally vampiric. It sucks the life out of people, places, histories, and things. Well, it sucks the life out of people and places and histories and the future to produce things. And so it's a big standing aggregate of lying. And it shouldn't be surprising to us when the organs of power within that aggregate dispose of the underprivileged at their pleasure, at their whim. And it's not just the underprivileged that get disposed of, but certainly, the primary onus of agony falls upon the poor, the minorities, the people they can easily get away with directly harming. And there's an aspect of our culture that views this as sport. And we've been seeing a little bit of that, a very tiny bit, right? We've been seeing just the very minute tip of the iceberg when we think about police publicly executing African American men primarily. But they publicly execute all kinds of people, not just African American men. However, it is true that the vast majority of those executions are perpetrated on minorities. But what I want to make clear is, I've heard people say in defense of this country that it's the best country in the world. There's nothing better anywhere. And it's conceivable that those people are correct. That this is the best nation to live in, generally speaking. That doesn't mean you'll survive living here. It doesn't mean you can live here and not be egregiously violated over and over and over again, as many of us have been. I am one of them. However, others have been violated far more severely and repeatedly than I. And some of the violations are traditional. We call them things like schools, malls, Hollywood, the military-industrial prison complex, There's a sort of vast machinery of torture that is hidden beneath this veneer of something we would refer to very ironically as civilization. And the lies are layered, right? So at the very lowest layers, you have the least privileged people who are actually either completely bereft of any experience of stability or health or well-being or the capacity to have and continue relationships. You have the homeless, the drug addicts, the prisoners, those people who just won't play the game of getting up and going to work from 9 to 5 every day to pay the man. And it's interesting that we have this colloquialism, the man, which indicates the overlords, the slave masters. We don't have this phrase, the woman. Although, in our culture, there are elite, wealthy females who, in fact, there are even elite females who distribute slavery among specifically other females for their profit. I'm going to leave that topic alone for the moment. So, in general, we have this phrase, the man. We got to pay the man. And the man means essentially the wealthy and the elite. The people who've played their way to the top of the mountain, to the top of the heap, so that they can both evade and profit from, in a very regularized, controllable, dependable way, the suffering of others and the decimation of the history and future of life on Earth. We're living in a mountain of layered lies. We live in what we call a nation, but it's really sort of a giant cone of torture and suffering and lying. And at the top of that mountain right now, there's an inveterate liar. There's never been a president in the history of my life, or that I am aware of, who could lie directly, just bald-facedly right through his teeth the way that Donald Trump does. And the reason that a guy like this can rise to power is because he represents the interests of many of the uppermost layers of the lying, thieving rapists that run our country, what we call our country. But what our country actually isn't what we think at all. It's a masquerade. It's a seething network of unimaginably cruel and horrific processes of violation it's a disease. It's a giant Disneyland-like disease where the facade is all happy and playful, but it's there to entertain slaves, right? And it's there to entertain slaves because the slaves don't have lives or roles that are meaningful in most of them, in any realistic fashion. And so there's a tiny little pinnacle of catastrophically wealthy people who profit, actually, when crisis occurs, when there's war. Yeah? And the whole charade has been going on now for a long time, and there's this idea that our country is noble. Well, it's going to be a little windy here, so you'll have to bear with any wind noise in the mic as I get to the sort of back of the park here. Now, if you'd ever been to prison, you'd know that there are different kinds of prisons. And I'm going to argue today that the thing our nation most resembles is a sort of combination of a catastrophically rapacious system of prisoneering with the sort of wrapper, the candy-like wrapper of a Disneyland on top. And the Disneyland is composed primarily of consumer experiences. Yeah? Just a moment. Hi. 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 There's a little child smiling at me. Maybe with a little luck, a child will escape the sort of bondage and confusion and slavery that many of us have had to not only endure, but celebrate. That's the really disgusting thing. We don't nearly have to endure the violations that we're subject to. We're apparently supposed to be so fucking excited about them that we celebrate them. With things called holidays. In any case, what I'm trying to get at is, it might be true that among the prison industrial nations, America's not a very bad prison to be in, overall. But what that means is it's really ridiculous. It means that the torture we'll directly experience ourselves is slightly less, or, quite a bit less in some cases, but modestly less than what people in countries such as North Korea or China are likely to experience, where industry much more closely resembles actually just straight up slavery in many instances. And graft and corruption and hierarchies of power and domination rule the day. Now here we've got a buffer, right? But if you look carefully at what's going on around you, you'll notice really bizarre features like machines have more actual rights than you do. Cars, they freely own terrain, right? They can just sit in a place undisturbed without paying any money or, having to worry about the man. And so objects, in many cases, in our situation, have more rights than humans do, and will be preserved. In fact, the bizarre, nonsensical nightmare in which we presently exist is so weird now that actually, in many cases, the data we produce just by existing is more valuable than our lives. So what that means is, formally, we are competing directly against the products of commercial industry, and now the products of electronic industry, for the right to survive at all, and we are losing. Because our governments will happily preserve property or data in preference to living beings. Yeah. So we've been in competition with industry and objects for a long time, and we and life on Earth have been losing that competition for a long time. Life on Earth particularly has just been being obliterated. And wherever commerce can hide the damage, they will. So it's a kind of game of like, who can you fuck without them telling anybody that matters? And the obvious eternal victim of that kind of behavior is nature, because she has no voice. There's a few humans who kind of, Diane Fossey and people of her ilk, the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society, Some of those people end up getting killed. They get murdered. But some of them survive long enough to have some tiny little impact in the game, or at least represent those of us who actually feel that the living places, the history and future of life on Earth is more important than objects and data and fucking photographs. Nobody's asking, while people are starving and we're obliterating the ecologies in Africa and South America, the last remaining terrestrial examples of the anciently conserved ecologies, without which our minds and bodies will die. We will perish. Our minds, we think we possess them locally, we don't. They are gifts of relation. And if you obliterate the roots of those relationships, those minds die. And so do the bodies. Not instantaneously, but the damage is communicated in the network of living beings instantaneously. There's features of that network that can sort of shamble on zombie-like while their underpinnings are obliterated and give the appearance of still being alive and indeed qualify as living. But the rich underneath, right, the rich sort of dark, deep soil from which our humanity and our intelligence and our organismal nature rises into us each instant, is being obliterated for the sake of objects and machines and profit, for the sake of abstract, tokenized value systems that have no value at all. They are valueless. Their only value lies in the abstract aspect of value, that you can use them to enforce slavery on others or buy yourself out of various kinds of harm, or purchase little paradisical, island habitats for you and your progeny. Perhaps if you're especially generous, your ancestors. So we're living in the best prison on Earth in the United States. And most of us realize it's a prison, except when weird things happen. And eventually, because of these strange little crises, and also pressure building up, right? So you've got like economic pressure, class on class pressure, political pressure, the pressure created by dividing us into little factions that see each other as the enemy, at least ideologically, if not physically. Those pressures eventually create hotspots, yeah? And we just happen to be in a fairly significant one right now. And so, at the moment, many of our citizens, who really, are mostly prisoners, they are kind of up in arms. They're sort of fed up with, and the layers of fictions that we've been living in service of are starting to wear thin or just rip and tear through. And we can see the egregious, malignant, cancerous monstrosities that actually underlie what we call our culture. And by the way, it isn't our culture. It's a culture of pirates and rapists, primarily, with a few relatively naive altruists sprinkled throughout there, trying to get other people to realize what the fuck has been going on. It was never a culture that we could be proud of. The idea that America was some heroic, democratic savior of the people of other nations, well, it's not like it never had any instance or degree of truth, but the primary underlying fictions have always been malignant. Because, your first move matters. If you start out as a bunch of sea pirates who rape and obliterate and pillage the lands of native people, that first move, it sticks with you, right? You can't wash that shit off. It's just like the first move in a relationship, right? If I meet someone and if I let's say I have to kill a bunch of children to get a date with a very attractive woman, right? There's no way to wash that off, right? the things I did before travel with me into the relationship with that woman. And it's the same kind of thing here. Although we ourselves did not commit these terrifying atrocities, we are the beneficiaries of them, and in that way, we are to some degree complicit, unless and until we either both make amends and or we do something so beautiful as human beings that the histories of atrocity are at least very modestly and incompletely atoned for. And in my daily life, I hope for a chance, moment to moment, I hope for a chance to have the opportunity to atone, to at one, to create something or engage in behavior so beautiful and human that it overcomes some of the weight of my complicity in the malignant atrocities that underlie and are, in fact, the foundations of our national behavior and identity. And that's a very difficult weight to carry. So most of us would prefer, and this is part of why that happens, to live in the fictions, right? It's so ugly to actually see into what more honestly has been going on and continues to go on, business as usual in the United States. It's so toxic and painful and vicious to see into that we naturally avoid taking a good close look at it the same way we avoid taking a good close look at the carnage of war or a car accident or some kind of hideous murder. And I'm not going to yell at anyone about that. It's natural for us to stay in the lanes that preserve some degree of sanity and hopefulness and joy. Right? We, too, have limited lifespans, and we don't want to spend them suffering. So that creates a kind of gravity toward delusion. The delusion that our nation is noble or heroic or beautiful, profound. Now, I'm not claiming that there haven't been noble and beautiful and profound people who've lived in and as exemplars of aspects of our national priorities, and indeed a few of the foundational ideas on which our nation are based, but which are almost never embodied, have some degree of beauty to them. The idea of equality, of access to opportunity, where there's a difference between opportunity and rape. The idea of liberty, that we shall not be oppressed unjustly, and yet pretty much every one of us are. And so there are some, ideas, foundational ideas, that when I was very young, I was naive enough to feel patriotic about. But I didn't yet know the whole story of the sea pirates who came and are still running everything. In fact, are presently we're being recolonized, right? Over and over again, these waves of the repetition of colonizing, of terrifying colonizing behavior is just running rampant, and it's invisible to us. It's like layer after layer of roiling colonization, but instead of being directly killed and raped and obliterated, we're being indirectly, most of us. Those, there are exceptions, as we've seen recently in the news, and as most of us have long been aware of. Where we can get away with it, where it can be gotten away with on the surface of things without having to hide it under a veneer, that's going on. And where the perpetrators need layers of fictions to protect them from that activity, they establish those layers, and we become complicit with both, things by our participation in the in the structured fiction of America. Hold on a moment here. Okay. Now this isn't a happy story, and it's not going to have a happy ending. But before I conclude my video today, I want to talk about the way that there's a hierarchy, right, of beneficiaries of essentially slavery, oppression, brutalization, and killing, violation. Hold on a moment. So there's a sort of layered mountain of these kinds of fictions that the beneficiaries float on the top, right? And up at the very top are the wealthy elites. Our current president is apparently one of those, or at least their puppet and or representative. And it's astonishing to me that this guy can just... Actually, I'm astonished that his own organs don't just leap out of his mouth and strangle him in shame every time he opens that mouth. This is one of the most disgusting human beings I've ever had the displeasure of being subject to. And ordinarily, I don't pay a lot of attention to politics and news, but in my current job, I'm somewhat required to, and it's a painful and very illness-like process. It is miserable. It's immiserating. But yeah, this is one of the most vile human beings I've ever had the displeasure of knowing of the existence of, or of having to speak about openly, having to consider. So there's the elite, wealthy, sort of corporate owners, the slave owners at the top, just like there always were. And these represent the kings and queens of the ancient colonial, the old colonial cultures that sent ships of pirates over here to obliterate and wipe out and steal the land of the Native American peoples and the Native South American peoples. And the same thing was done in Africa and Australia and pretty much New Zealand, wherever it could be done, right? And we didn't have to watch that, but we are still the beneficiaries of it. And we didn't participate in it directly, but again, we still benefit from all of that atrocity and violation and killing and rape and horror. And so for this reason I say we are not noble. How can we be noble with a history like this? Especially if we won't admit it and atone for it somehow, right? And it's not really possible to fully atone, but we could at least make some gestures, meaningful gestures toward atonement, both as individuals and as, societal segments and as a culture. And I think we must somehow. Whether or not we do it together is a different question and a more complex topic. And what could motivate us to do that is another complex topic. But they're topics we have to explore. We need to, I think. We being everybody in the United States who lives here, and in South America, and in Africa, and New Zealand, and Australia, and all the places where there yet remains some modest indigenous segment. Yeah. So we've got the sort of elite, the slave owners that are the modern equivalent of the aristocracy or kings and queens. Underneath them we have the prison military industrial complex. Our country has spent trillions of dollars on the military. And what that means is it's not just that we spent trillions of dollars there, and more than a few trillions. And by the way, if you think the accounting of that is correct, you're crazy, because where trillions of dollars are the figures we're dealing with, you can hide billions of dollars of theft all over the place. You can make vast fortunes just disappear. You can do all kinds of magic tricks. So, we've got like the prison military industrial complex at the top, and the military is by far the sort of greatest beneficiary, and it's a gigantic mechanically structured fiction that protects primarily in our country the extremely wealthy, and can instantaneously turn on everybody else. Anyone who wanted to foment something resembling a revolution would quickly discover that the military complex in the United States is effectively unopposable unless they can be convinced to avoid turning against their own people. Let me check something here for a moment. This young raven. The young raven is still learning what's edible and what isn't. And that's the parent over there, I think, or possibly a sibling. It's fascinating to watch them learn and grow. They're very precocious and beautiful. I love these. I love all of life, but particularly fond of corvids, the family of birds that ravens and blue jays and magpies and crows belong to. And this guy here, I don't know if you can see, but he's got a little red. You can see a little red at the edge of his or her beak. And he's curious about me, right? He knows that I might feed him. It's conceivable. He's been fed by other humans, you can tell. So he's coming over to kind of check out, he or she, and check out what's going on and see, like, is this edible? Is that edible? Is that food? What's this? Oh, a flower. Oh, some grass. Maybe I can eat that. And successfully finding some, early successful foraging, learning about which things are food and which things aren't. Trying to understand the nature of the world in which this creature exists as an extension of me and I as an extension of him or her. And yes, I use the traditional gender pronouns. String me up if you need to. So the military complex is one of the primary beneficiaries, and it's not really a person, although there's a hierarchy in there of pay grades and power. It's a construct, yeah. So it's different from the people at the top that actually benefit, but it protects their benefits and ensures them. And then there's the corporate ecosystem, corporate industrial ecosystem, which serves the military industrial complex and keeps the slaves happy by producing little tchotchkes for them to buy and exchange, as though these were the meaningful results of the investment of human lives and behavior and activity and work, what we call work, which for the vast majority of Americans is essentially just slavery. And it's slavery to roles so degrading. It's funny, I've heard people say, like, I wouldn't do that to an animal, as if animals should be degraded more than humans. But I would say, like, I wouldn't do that to a machine, right? I wouldn't even want a machine to have a role that deprived. But what I really mean is just that the humans are acting out the roles that would otherwise be that in a more enlightened society wouldn't exist. They're so reprehensibly deprived of meaning and identity and value that we wouldn't consider, we would never get started with such agendas, let alone continue them. So, the corporate ecosystem, the corporate infrastructural ecosystem, is essentially where most of the slaves work. And there's a hierarchy in there of degrees of torture. One moment, someone keeps messaging me. Let me see who this is. All right. I'm also a slave at the moment, though for quite some time I was independent enough that I was kind of on top of the slave pile. I didn't have bosses, but presently I have a boss, and I'm heading home to do further daily service in my little role as slave. And it's a miserable role, I have to say. In any case, one of the living beehives, one of the natural beehives in the park. There's a couple in these two trees here. This is one of them that I love. It's up in that knothole. So on the mountain of like agony, on the fucking seven rings of the modern Dante's hell, purgatory or whatever you want to call it. There's these layers, right? And they get broader as they go down, which means the populations inside them grow geometrically. The people at the very top is a minute fraction of human beings. The military-industrial complex is very thoroughly populated with slaves, but has a relatively modest number of highly placed, highly protected masters. And the corporate ecology is similar. And then you have the sort of baseline stuff of the middle class in the United States, the truly poor, and then the population of homeless people and actual just straight up prisoners in our prison systems, which have become for-profit enterprises. So those enterprises actually directly profit when people get sentenced, and that creates an abjectly unjust situation where the more people you can imprison, the more money and power you can acquire. In other words, the more money and power the masters of that system acquire. I have left the relative sanctuary of the garden and am now back in the surreal box facade of the ordinary human world. Where cars have once again become a dominating principle, and motorcycles and sports cars. These have returned to domination of the local environment in a way that is so catastrophically abusive and toxic that in anything but a society that was absolutely insane, it would be impossible. But these are part of the structure of what we think of as privilege, right? We have the privilege of owning vehicles and of being renters and mortgagees. By the way, the word mortgage actually means like death gauge. Mort is death in Latin. So yeah, some of us have the privilege of paying mortgages and then owning homes. Others of us pay our landlords, and in this structure you once again see the necessity of ongoing slavery to acquire the basic necessities of shelter, food, clothing that we need to continue lives that are mostly so fucking disoriented as to be nearly unworth living. I mean, what are we living for? The opportunity to watch films, to buy cars, to pay the landlord, or the taxes that fund atrocity? So this is what I'm talking about when I say we're living in a structured sort of science fiction nightmare that, while it might be one of the better prisons on Earth, is still essentially a prison. And some few of us are now becoming relatively upset at the places where we have seen the fabric of our nation, of the layered fictions, the layered fabrics, wear thin or just tear through, right? And it's not like that hasn't been going on forever. It's been going on forever. It's just that there's a little more pressure now. Things are a little more tense overall. And the pressure injected by the novel coronavirus pandemic has upped the ante a bit, right? People have had to stay in their houses for a little while. And some people thought that was a kind of imprisonment. I'm not suggesting that, actually. I think that there are many important aspects of social sort of cooperation so that we need to engage in, so that the pandemic doesn't collapse our extremely shoddy, however seemingly technologically advanced, our very shoddy and underfunded medical infrastructure in the United States. Now, doesn't to say there aren't, even in the medical infrastructure, this is the same thing. There's layers of care, from extremely crude and ineffective, or even toxic, dangerous, misguided, to profoundly expensive and very effective, relatively speaking, so that the extremely wealthy have access to incredibly advanced, by modern standards, degrees of care, and the poor are primarily divested of their health by slavery, injury, illness, and sort of being repetitively beaten down over their lives. But that medical infrastructure is absolutely crucial to the functioning of our slave system, and if that thing breaks down, we are fucked. Now, I mean, we're fucked anyway, but we're a lot more fucked without hospitals. So, the reason for wearing masks and sheltering in place has to do with keeping our medical infrastructure from collapsing under the sudden surge stress of the pandemic. And I'm in agreement with that process. In that, I think we have to work to protect each other from the possibility both of, dying or being permanently maimed or horrifically injured by contracting COVID, because it's a very complex and very mysteriously novel syndrome that's probably not merely a respiratory syndrome. There's a lot we don't know yet about that. So we need to protect each other from that. We also need to protect the relatively fragile medical ecologies and infrastructure. Meaning we need our skilled nurses, we need our doctors. We can't just sacrifice them for the sake of trying to survive something that we were incautious enough to exacerbate by reckless behavior. So in any case, I'm getting close to my home, and I've mostly kind of been venting a bit today, but I wanted to talk about the difference between this incredible mess of layered fictions that we call America, and the idealized sort of nonsense cartoon version that lives in many of our minds, or in the minds of many of our citizens. This is not heroic. This is tragic. We've committed cascades of atrocity over time for which no atonement is actually possible. You can't rebuild the oceans or the Amazon or the ecologies that have been obliterated. You can't subtract the plastic from the environment. You can't subtract the millions of tons of antibiotics and industrial chemistries that we've poisoned the planet with. There's no going back, right? And whether or not there's anything like a forward depends on our capacity to unify intelligently, compassionately, morally, nobly, and accomplish something that preserves and allows us the direct experience of the most fundamentally beautiful and intelligent aspects of our humanity. And I hope, regardless of my grave doubts that we'll ever have that opportunity and my pessimism, I yet remain hopeful and continue to work in that direction, as I hope you will as well. Thank you for joining me. Bye-bye for now.